Hello, welcome to CDCon 2020. Today we are going to be talking about the power of open source community, something that is near and dear to all of our panelists' hearts. I am joined today by Tracy Ragan. She is CDF board member. She is CDF governing board member and CEO of DeployHub. I am also joined by Marky Jackson. He is a CDF ambassador, and also he is director of open source at OpsMX. I am Jacqueline Salinas. I am director of ecosystem and community development for the CD Foundation. Thank you so much for joining us today for this panel on the power of open source community. So we decided to do this panel, and it kind of evolved from a case study that came out of CloudBees about Marky's journey into DevOps and the open source community. I got the idea to do a podcast, and that kind of snowballed into a keynote at DevOps World 2020 and also in this session. So thank you so much, Marky and Tracy, for joining me today. I will let them introduce their stories of how they got to open source and what their DevOps journey has been like. So Tracy, what has your DevOps journey been like?
Well, I have been doing DevOps literally all of my professional career. When I started coding on the mainframe, and DevOps is something automated on the mainframe. And then when I jumped over to a platform that was open, what they called the open systems platform, there was no DevOps. And so I started being the one that had to write the make files and worry about trying to get a build done. And that's how I begun my journey in DevOps. And over the course of time, I kind of, literally I force gumped my way into a software company. I have another company that I started in 1995 called OpsMX Software. And it was during that time that I was introduced to open source. And it sort of changed my way of seeing how software can be developed. I was very skeptical in the beginning. I was like, open source it's just not going to really ever happen. Who's going to give away their source code and allow other companies to commercialize their code? And then IBM did. And I was invited to be the token woman at the Eclipse Foundation. And I sat on that board for about 5 years. And I learned a ton about open source governance, the importance of creating a community that can start having discussions about serious topics. And in that case, it was how the IDE needs to morph and change for supporting different compilers, different like software development practices. And that's really what the Eclipse Foundation begun as, is a place to really talk about the IDE and how to build it. And at that point in time, I met a lot of folks. I've met some folks that are now at the Linux Foundation. I've met some of the folks at Red Hat. I was able to be a small little startup sitting in a room with giants, and I was the only woman. So it made it a very interesting experience for me. But it created a community that I had not understood before. And now, as we begin building out an open source community around our DeployHub product, a community called Ortelius, I am beginning to really understand at the project level how important open source is on so many levels. From the beginning of understanding how open source can be an educator, how open source can bring together people from all over the world. I've been talking to people from Romania, from India, from South Africa, from the United States, from Germany, from England, and we all get together and we get to talk about core problems in the microservices platform. And then we also talk about other things, our personal journeys, and we just become friends. And how often does that happen, really? An open source community goes beyond just a cool technology. It is all about reaching down to somebody who may not have ever coded in Python and say, yeah, we can give you some Python code to work on, and we'll help you learn to do that. We have a person who has always been in QA. She wants to get into project management. She wants to do that with the open source community. What better way to build out your resume, right? It is an amazing way. It's an amazing platform, really. Open source is an amazing platform that goes beyond just, you know, a governing body of where the open source should be stored. And if you look at tools like Jenkins, Jenkins is an amazing community of developers. And what Jenkins did for CloudBees is an amazing story. And then we have Rancher. Look what Rancher's done. Rancher, in a few short years, went from a company doing support for $30 million company to something like $600 million with SUSE. So open source is a serious contender in a commercial market, but at the core of it, it has heart. It is really the heart of software development.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing your story, Tracy. Marky, what about you? What was your journey like? How did you get started in DevOps?
Well, I had a really difficult upbringing. So I grew up in a boys' home, and I didn't think I'd amount to anything. I was a statistic, if you will. And I had a friend. I went over to his house, and this was back in the days of the Tandy TRS-80s. And his dad was playing a game that I had never seen, and I was asking about the game, and he's telling me about it, and I was like, "Where did you buy that at?" And he basically explained that he'd written it in this language called BASIC, and I was like, okay. And it became this like sort of mentorship where he started teaching me how to write code, and it was really cool, and it was fun and exciting. And I really I think what I enjoyed most about it was the fact that what I was doing didn't matter what my background was or who my parents were. It was something that I could control. And that was an awesome feeling of empowerment. I wound up finding out that the gentleman that had given me this introduction and mentorship into code was actually a NASA scientist, and he built the actual rockets that keep the space shuttle in orbit, which was really cool. And I had a lot of mentors along the way. I worked for a company back before online gaming, and it was a company called Jasmine Multimedia, and the CEO was Jay Samet, and this guy really took me under his wing and showed me a lot of really awesome things. And I went on to Yahoo and Symantec, and I worked a 9-to-5 job as a software. Back then we were called software programmers for a very long time. And when I got the chance to sort of go work in this sort of startup world, which Yahoo wasn't really a startup. They were a large company at the time, but they had the startup feel to them. It really turned me on to all of these things. And that's how I got into projects like Kubernetes and Jenkins. And I just, it's opened so many doors for me. I've met so many amazing, amazing people that I consider like dear friends. And I don't think you could get that anywhere. Open source is just an amazing thing. It's taken me all over the world. It's taken me to war zones. I've been to Iraq and Afghanistan. And it's just amazing. Like, I'm so thankful for my life because of open source.
That's amazing. Thank you, Marky, for sharing your story. And I think that's really the heart of it. It's really about people. And this is also why I'm so passionate about my role, and why I'm so passionate about getting programs off the ground for the CDF that gets the community involved and engaged, is because I too did not grow up in a traditional home where a lot of the times it did seem like having a career was not the path that was going to be for me. Being a statistic seemed a lot easier because that's a lot of the time what society has assigned to you, and it's sometimes really challenging to break away from that mold. But I have found individuals like Tracy who have mentored me from a very young age, through college, through personal experiences, through careers. And I think that's really the most amazing thing I've gotten out of open source, has been also the powerful connections I've made with other individuals, how I've been able to grow my network, mentor other individuals, engage and welcome new contributors to the community. And I think that's the really exciting part about open source. And I'm really excited that you are contributors and you are helping shape the culture of open source within the CDF community, because it's so important to have a space to welcome everybody, especially in times during our history where we are being purposely divided. I think this is the perfect time for us and the perfect space to really bring unity. And, you know, we spend so much time working that we spend more time with our families. Excuse me, we spend more time with our working families than we do with our own families. And I think COVID's changed that. So I think that's really an interesting segue into how has open source and COVID kind of, like, what's happened there? What's
Wow.
how yeah, how has that how has COVID, yeah, impacted open source, or how has that impacted the community? What's been your perspective?
I think during the initial days of the shelter in place, at the time I lived in the Bay Area, and it was scary because you didn't know what was going on. And but what was there was open source community. So people would get on Zooms, they would have happy hours, and it was those little things. Like, I'm just going to speak from my own experience. I was afraid. I was super scared. Like, I didn't know what the world was going to happen, if it was going to end the next day. But there was this little community that got on, and they'd get on Zoom and they'd talk, or they'd hang out after a conference and have a happy hour and laugh together. And that really made a lot. It really meant a lot to, I think, people that may have just been, would sit alone, and this was their outlet. That to me was awesome. And some of these people I've known, I've met in public, and they're great, but some of these people I've never even met, and now they're like the closest friends that I have. So I think, well, COVID it's a horrible thing. There were some silver linings to it. I think it brought the community together, and I think some individuals that may have been alone and down really helped them. I know for me it did.
Tracy, what about you? What's been your experience like with open source and kind of the new normal?
Yeah, so we have kind of thought about bringing the core of DeployHub to an open source community for a while. In fact, it's been an open source product now for about 2 years is when we actually licensed it out as an open source product in GitHub. But it wasn't until COVID where I said to myself, this is actually the time to start building an open source community, because people are home and some of them are alone. And what better way to reach out to your peers and say, hey, you want to work on a project together? And I'm finding that people who have never ever thought about joining an open source project are listening to me and are starting to sign up, and I'm super excited about it. In particular, I'm looking for women to join the Ortelius open source project, and I've reached out to several of them, and some of them never ever thought that they had the coding skills to be a part of an open source project. And there's a myth that you have to be some really outstanding programmer in order to be part of an open source community, and that is purely a myth. So COVID actually has opened a door for me, because I would have probably never thought about reaching out to the people the way I am reaching out to them now if I didn't think, I'm sitting here by myself and I'm alone and I'm thinking about this. I need to just start going out on LinkedIn and asking people if they want to chat about an open source project. And it's surprising how many people want to do that, and how many people are interested in being involved in an open source project, but thought maybe that they would never be accepted. I've had women tell me that they've tried before, they've created a pull request and nobody's ever responded, or they just didn't think that they had the right skill set. And we're bringing them all in. We're bringing them all in and saying, go for it. Let's see what you want, how you want to contribute, and how we can help you contribute. And I don't think we would be doing that if everybody was going out to restaurants or having a normal life. I think COVID has given us an opportunity to build an open source community in a way that we wouldn't have had this horrible pandemic not hit the world.
Yeah, absolutely. Now this kind of takes me back to, I want a little bit of a flashback from your guys' perspective. When was the first time you contributed to an open source community? Marky, I'll start off with you.
Wow. I think the first open source community I contributed to was Jenkins. And that was a long time ago. Like, back when, if anybody knows who KK is, back when he was still active actively writing code. So that was a long time ago. And then the second was Kubernetes at the very beginning of Kubernetes, but pre 1.0.
Tracy, what about you?
The Eclipse Foundation. It was 1997 when I joined the Eclipse Foundation. I have personally never worked on an open source project, which is weird. I've always been at the governance board level.
Okay.
And, been involved in, licensing, open source licenses. That for the Eclipse Foundation, that was almost a year project to figure out, what proper open source license we should be running under. So I've never actually been at a project level. So that's why I'm pretty excited about being involved in Ortelius, because I can actually see how an open source community itself works as opposed to the governing level of it. Not that it's pretty different actually, being on a governance board and being at the community level. And I think that being at the community level is so much more fun than being at the governing board level. But at the governing board level, there are bigger challenges to think about, like outreach, adoption, who to bring in, how to fund the project. So there's a lot of hard issues to resolve at the governing board level, but the people and the real heart comes at the project level, and that's what I'm learning.
Yeah. I mean, I get to see both sides of it because I get to collaborate with the governing board and I get to collaborate with the community. But yes, the problems that you get to tackle in the community are so much more fun to solve than the problems that the governing board has. But thank you so much for sharing. I just wanted to wrap up really quickly with our last question, and it's, why do you keep coming back? Why do you keep contributing to open source communities?
Well, I'll go first. For me, it certainly has been a pretty core part of my career since those early days at the Eclipse Foundation. I have left open source for a while because the Eclipse Foundation got really kind of big and I was trying to run my own company and it was hard to do both. But I came back to the CD Foundation mainly because I was asked by this amazing woman by the name of Tracy Miranda, who also had been on the Eclipse Foundation. And the way she pitched it made me realize that I had something to give. And so the feeling of being in service to others I'm sort of I love to volunteer. I have done volunteer work in all kinds of different areas, from rebuilding a historic ballpark in our local community to being on open source projects. So to be of service to somebody else is it's a gift, really, and I really do believe that. It's a gift to serve other people. And open source always brings me back to that kind of core part of myself that is a serial volunteer. And that's what does it. It's the people and the connection to others and the ability to take my experience and to grow something bigger because of my background. What could be better? There's not a whole lot that's better in life than being able to be of service to others because of what you already know.
Absolutely. Thank you, Tracy. And Marky, what about you? What keeps you coming back?
Legacy. Legacy is a big thing for me. I recently got sick, and when you kind of think you may die, that's scary. And you kind of think to yourself, what am I leaving behind? Do I feel okay? Was I a good enough citizen to the world that I left some impression? And I keep coming back because maybe it's a selfish reason, is legacy. If I can give somebody that feeling that I got when that NASA scientist showed me how to write a code, if I can give that to somebody else, and they can give that to somebody else and give that to somebody else, that's a legacy. And that makes me feel good about myself, that I'm not being, I said selfish, but I'm not being selfish. I'm giving something to people, and it's making them happy. And it's showing them that they're not a statistic. Just because you're a woman doesn't mean you can't code. Even if you don't know, we're going to help you. Just because you're a person of color doesn't mean you don't belong here. Doing those things, that's a legacy. And that's why I keep coming back.
Thank you so much, Marky. That means so much as well for me, Tracy. We keep coming back because we believe people matter. And that's something that we hope everybody from the CDF community takes away. And we are so excited to be wrapping up the Power of Open Source community, which has really helped us spread the word about the CD Foundation. There are many ways to get involved, like we've spoken about. There is no limitation to your technical capabilities. We definitely need help when it comes to event planning, doing outreach, copy edit, whatever it is that you have a skill set, know that you can contribute and you can keep paying it forward with those skills, and we'll help you learn if that's what you want. Thank you so much to all of you, and I'm really excited to wrap up.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thank
Tracy.
you. Thank you, Jackie.